Oh, you skipped your part.
Forgot.
Can minimize this
Up
right
at the
here.
top, you can minimize it. You can only error that one.
Okay, my name is Jason Carney, and for several years now, on and off, I've been doing training on various subjects. Back in the day, it was WinForms and Visual Studio 2012. And, Kim and I decided to focus on 2015 to get started. It's not just an overview of what's new to 2015. It's more of a, this is how you use Visual Studio, and we're using 2015 to do it. I started out my career almost 17 years ago doing Cold Fusion, and after many years of doing that, I moved over to Visual Studio 1.0, and it was just called Visual Studio back then. And actually, the first job doing Visual Studio was .NET, was building an ASP.NET site, 1.1 for a company that had a Cold Fusion application up, very large, 80,000 plus e-commerce application, and they wanted to move it over into ASP.NET. So taught their team, showed them how to use what I thought was Visual Studio back then. Spent several more years, went on to National City, Regions Bank, and after about 4 years, I was doing an interview and did really well in the interview. I was really looking forward to the job. It was a big company. And out of the blue, the manager said, okay, one last step. We want you to do we want to sit down with you and watch you write a small project, write a small application in Visual Studio. I wasn't worried about coming up with architecture for a small project. What I was worried about was having somebody watch me fumble around in Studio. Even though I've been using it for 4 years, it's big and confusing, and a lot of things I used it more like a text editor than an actual IDE. And I found that doing paired programming nowadays, they don't call it that anymore. But I found out that a lot of people do that. And then on the other hand, I find programmers that have only been programming not even a year showing me really cool stuff that I had no idea you could do in Visual Studio. So I started teaching it just so I could learn it better. And then that was back in 2012, I think was the first version. And then come to find out that that seems to be, now this is a little bit different environment. I'm curious to see, how many people in here use Visual Studio? So just about everybody. Except for Keith, got the trouble. So what I found out was that most people used it like I used it. Even some of the more senior developers. You'd see a couple tricks here and there that were kind of cool, but especially debugging. I mean, I would do everything I could to figure out what was going wrong before I went into the debugger, because that was really confusing for a long time. And I wasn't used to it coming from a Cold Fusion background. So we just did it the hard way. So I'm curious to see, has anybody actually been to a course in Visual Studio and how to use it? So that's what I've been finding. I was curious if it would be a little bit different since we're so close to academia here. But yeah, it's odd that this is our tool, and it's a really powerful tool and really complex, and can save us literally hundreds of hours a month individually of working, and we've never been taught actually how to use it. And it's kind of hard when you sit down, especially as a mid-level or senior developer, when you're sitting with other people that are trying to show them how to fix a bug or something, and you really don't know your tool. It can be embarrassing because you fumble around and you know the answer, but you can't remember where something's at because you haven't used it in a while. One of the biggest things that's confusing about Visual Studio is that, as you can see, there's a lot to it. There's probably hundreds or thousands of different tools and options, and you're not really sure what you're going to do that may do something that means you're never going to get that back again, that tool or that option. So, like I said, and The part that's most confusing is that Visual Studio does everything. And depending on what you do typically on a daily basis is what you really want to see. And what Visual Studio is actually really good at with the presets at setting up for you. So you're seeing what you're used to working with. But you know all that other stuff is out there, and you always wonder, am I supposed to be using that? Is that something I'm supposed to be doing? And the answer is no. Most of the stuff that is in Visual Studio you probably will never use because that's not the type of application you typically work on a daily basis. Visual Studio is meant, it's very flexible. There's nothing hard-coded in Visual Studio. You can configure just about everything in Visual Studio. And it's meant to set up the way you use it for the tools that you use, and that's it. So even though at first when you look at it and even years of stumbling through it, it feels very daunting, once you get it fine-tuned down to exactly what you're good at and what you use it for, every once in a while you'll find something new that's cool, but usually it becomes very simple to use. So one other thing I want to talk to you about, which I cleared with Tim to make sure, is 6 or 7 years ago, I was working for a company called Travel Centers of America. And they're the second biggest truck stop company in the country. They own Petro. The biggest one is Flying J and Pilot. They own Pilot. But anyway, I've been working there for about a year full time. And well, actually about a year and a half. And I started hearing, this is towards the end of WinForms, and I started hearing a lot of terms in the web. I'm a web developer that I had never heard before and I wasn't really familiar with. And I found out that real quick that my skills were getting very stale very fast because the web community was changing really quickly. And so I started hitting the books and studying and getting back into it. And about 2.5 years ago, I found Pluralsight. Anybody in here familiar with Pluralsight? It'll absolutely, if you just take an hour a week, it'll absolutely change your career path. I mean, you will go years beyond where you would have been in just a year or two. And it just takes a little dedication, and it's interesting. You'll find you create libraries in there that you want to watch that you'll never have time to watch. But the great things about it are you learn from Microsoft MVPs. You learn the terminology that you should be using, how to pronounce words like mammal. When you read it out of a book, that's not very obvious that you pronounce it as mammal. There's just so many things you learn, and also little things you learn on the side that don't even have to do with what you're learning at that moment. But you can really dial in what you want to do in your career. You can really dial in because everything is getting so big. It used to be you were a web developer, you did everything from the front end to the back end. Nowadays, you can just work in the browser and have a really good career filling spots. So I don't have any affiliation with Pluralsight other than 2.5 years ago I started paying them to let me use their materials so I could study. And I am using, there are currently 2 Visual Studio 2015 tutorials out there. I think 3 hours and 5 hours worth. This one is that I'll be covering. I'm using Kate Gregory's slides just to help me through this because it would take me hours and hours and hours to create this, and it wouldn't be as good as what she's put together. So we do have Pluralsight licenses here from what Tim has told me. Just need to I think talk to Tim or Raj to figure out how you guys, or Mike maybe, how you guys are going to implement that using it. Again, the free version though, if you want to do it yourself, it's like $29, or not free, it's $29 a month. They do have a free month, and see if you like it, use it. $29 a month gets you all the videos, and $49 gets you all the code. The code, by the way, I have used in many. It's not the simple hello world type code in general. It's code that you can use to start off a project and get a really good jump on it. Okay, so getting started today, we're going to be doing a lot of talking about just getting up and going. Like Tim said, we're going to be spending several weeks just on Visual Studio. There's so much to it. Today is going to be a little bit boring in that we're starting off very simple. You know, just how to get the solution up and running and how to create solutions and projects and just some of the basics. We'll be talking about projects and solutions today. Namespaces and everything underneath and on are going to be in future weeks. And there's a lot of this stuff you're like, I know this. I know projects and solutions. It was years before I realized there's a difference between settings and properties. So we'll go over that today. Again, personalized Visual Studio, we'll read that in the weeks to come. Using UI components, relationships and code. That's actually a really fun one because we spend a lot of our time looking at other people's code, or worse, I've done this myself, looking at code that you think is absolutely horrible and you realize you wrote it about 2 years ago. It's good. Visual Studio offers a really good way of getting through that and understanding what other people were thinking. Search and find, that can be super effective. There's also a lot of things that Visual Studio does to try and help you. A lot of times it gets in the way, like IntelliSense, happens all the time, that I'm trying to, I'll hit Control Space or a dot, and it drops down right in front of what I was trying to look at so I know what to type in. And that bothered me for a long time until I learned that you could just hold down the Control button and it fades out so you can see what's behind it and then finish what you were doing. So Visual Studio does a lot of little things like that to help you through. Basic debugging features. I found that, including myself for a long time, we didn't even have basic debugging features. I didn't know you could drag up the yellow line and go back through what you just messed up. I would stop, start, and get all frustrated. And there's setup watches. You can use the command window to type out what is that. Just a lot of things you can do, just basics. And then we got some additional stuff that'll actually kind of really surprise you. It'll make you wonder why you spent so long struggling with the debugger. Working with the designers. I don't do this very often anymore. I did back when I built a couple WPF apps. You work heavily in designers on that. But in Visual Studio, when you're building pages, WinForms I used to, but even then, I typically would just click out to the WinForms so that I could double-click on something and create the code behind and just start writing. Some useful extensions we'll go over. IntelliTrace and CodeMap is only on the enterprise version, so we won't be covering that anytime soon. Okay. Okay, so Visual Studio can do a whole bunch of different application types. One of the things that makes it kind of intimidating sometimes. It can do native, which at this point is only C++, meaning non.NET, and then manage anything .NET. We can create client applications that run on Windows. We can create web applications that run on a web server, and nowadays, the last couple of years, we create web applications that actually run on the browser, called SPA, single page applications. Visual Studio has plugins that you can use for JavaScript, all kinds of really nice stuff for working with JavaScript. Some of the other types of applications you can build are like console applications, Windows services. I'm not sure if you guys don't know what Windows services is. It's basically anything running in the bottom down here, scheduled tasks, stuff that runs in the background, typically doesn't have a UI to it. Web services, that's anything that needs to communicate with each other. It's a standard protocol. This is where WCF comes in, Windows Communication Foundation, also Web API, a newer one. And then basically just provides standards for different machines to communicate either on a network or over the internet. And then a server, which is, as a web developer, I worked with all the time and never realized it was just an application that listens on a port and responds to requests, which isn't entirely true anymore since we can do stuff like SignalR now. So projects and solutions. I'll show you this in a few minutes, but everything in Visual Studio is under a solution. A lot of times you create a project, if you're just going to create a simple little project, Visual Studio will intentionally hide the solution around it, but Visual Studio runs off the solution. It doesn't run off the project. Okay. And it's the project, though, the project type that you build either executables or dynamic link libraries. And they can contain a bunch of different types of code. They've even got plugins now, I think, for PHP, and you can write all kinds of different stuff. And you only have one solution, and Visual Studio can only run one solution at a time. But a solution can have an unlimited number of projects inside of it. And I'm sure Raj and Mike and Brandon would disagree with that. You wouldn't want a ginormous solution that should be broken out architecturally, but you can literally put in as many as you want. It's just going to take a lot longer for Visual Studio to fire up. You can build individual projects at a time, or you can build the whole solution at a time. One of the things that I get a lot of questions on is what's the difference between build and rebuild? And does anybody know that answer? I know you did. What is it? Huh?
I'm not answering. Go ahead.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, they cleans the solution and then builds it again.
Correct, which is the same thing as doing it the hard way in that clean solution and then build solution. We do the same thing. And when he says clean solution, that means dumps out all the anything in the bin. It just cleans everything out, which sometimes you need to do. Some things get hung up sometimes. Now, while I'm doing the demo part, when we get to that in the next slide here, if anybody has any thoughts or something they know about that I missed or that I don't even know about, one of the things that Tim and I are trying to do is get everybody involved, more interested in doing these things. So please chime in, let me know. The only thing we got to watch out for is that when teaching this class, once we get to the Visual Studio part, at any given moment in Visual Studio, there's 50 to 100 things we can talk about that are right in our face. And it's real easy to get off track and start talking about all the little things coming up. And then we blow out the rest of the weeks and we don't really cover anything that we mentioned today. So the difference between settings and properties, okay? In the dictionary, they're the same words, just like preferences, options. But in the Visual Studio context, when I'm talking about Visual Studio, settings apply to anything in the actual IDE for you. Okay, so any of the settings you change in Visual Studio, you make the Solution Explorer bigger, you drag something off into its own window, you change the font, the colors, whatever you do, those types of settings are for you only. You're not going to screw anybody up. If you check that in and they open it up and all of a sudden their solution window is, half the screen or whatever. It doesn't affect anybody else. It's only, but it affects every solution you open. So whatever settings you left the last one at, when you open a new one, it's going to be at those settings, even if it's a totally different solution. Okay. The tool panes, the theme, font choices, all of those types of things have to do with the IDE that you're using for yourself. Okay, you can't screw anybody else up. The properties, though, and a lot of times people confuse these with options because you go tools, options, but it's really the settings. The properties affect projects and solutions. So anything you do, if you open it, and we'll do this, open up the solutions property or the properties on a project, anything you change in there will get saved to that property and that solution, and will get stored in Team Foundation server, and when the next person downloads that code and opens it, they're going to see those changes. Now, one of the things that used to really confuse me is actually, I jumped ahead, so we'll hold off on that. Okay, so this is just a little solution I got off of Microsoft. It's not mine, I didn't write it, but anybody can download it. And it's basically just to show, to give me something to talk about. So right off the bat, Visual Studio, again, one of the things that Visual Studio excels at is you can get to anything or see anything pretty much from anywhere. There's so many different ways to get to things that it's part of one of the reasons it gets confusing. So right off the bat, we can see that the name of the solution is Async Fine Tuning CS up here, and also all the way over here. Okay. This is the Solution Explorer. I'm sure pretty much everybody's familiar with this. But Microsoft does a lot of icon use. Anytime you highlight over an icon, it'll tell you what it is, and also it shortcuts to it. I know some shortcuts. I'm more of a clicky guy, but so these are telling you that these are C# projects. You have your references under here. This is going to open not what I wanted. Configuration file, designer. This is just a simple WPF app, and mainly when you get used to seeing the symbol, the icons that Visual Studio uses heavily, you can get a sense of what you're looking at just by the icons. So you can see there's two methods in this class. Again, I told you this first session is going to be a little bit boring. So, under Tools and Options, this is another place that can be pretty daunting, is that you can pretty much set up anything and everything in here. And one of the first things I typically do is go into Text Editor, General, all languages, and turn on line numbers. For some reason, I don't know why, Visual Studio doesn't ship with line numbers, but whenever you see a bug or an error, it shows the line number it's on. And you can double click it and it'll take you right to it, but then you're moving around where there may be more than one. A very simple way to get to that is if you already have the file open, it's just hit Control-G, type in the line number, and it'll take you right to it. But unless you see the line numbers on the side, it's hard to navigate around. I don't know, I see a lot of people who don't have it turned on, and for me, it's a real hard thing to do. But again, it would take us a whole day to go through everything you can do in here. But the first one I always turn on is the line numbers. And the other thing I typically turn on right away is if you go into tabs. This is another one of my weirdness things. Space is driving me nuts. I'm not a fast typer. And when I'm trying to, you can format code nicely by hitting Control-K, Control-D. But when you're trying to move things in and out and you're dealing with 5 spaces all the time, it's much easier to just set the indent size, the tab size to 5, indent size to 5, and force it to keep tabs. And from then on, every time you open up somebody else's code or your old code, as soon as you format it, it gets rid of all that extra junk in there and just makes everything nice and neat and clean. And with one delete, you can move the line without having to hit 5 times just to get something to happen. Those are the two main things that I do. Other than that, I really don't spend a lot of time in here. Okay. So the other thing that people get confused on is, so this is bold. That means that if I was to hit debug or start, it's going to fire off that application. And this is obviously the executable. Most likely these are just libraries that executable counts on. So if there was another executable in there, which I've had, you could select that one also to run, okay? Or you have to set it off, so I should say that differently. You could set that one instead to run when you hit debug. That's basically just the way of saying, this is the one I want to start with. If you go into the solution, right-click, go to Properties. This is the one that I find myself staring at sometimes because I meant to go to the Project Properties, which is actually useful. There's really not much you do in here. The only times I'm ever in here are to set whichever one I'm going to start, and a much easier way to do that I'll show you in a second. On the project we're working on right now, though, we have to fire up a backend API when we fire up the front end, otherwise nothing will work. So you can set up multiple libraries to fire up if you need to in here. But typically, you don't go in there very often because you can set a startup project just by going right-clicking on it and saying set a startup project. Okay? So the reason I find myself staring at that is because this is usually the one I meant to come to. And this is where you can actually do a lot of interesting things. Set up what page you want to start externally, project, what browser you want to start with, a lot of different things. I typically don't play with the command line because I don't create applications that typically need that. And that's pretty much all on the, it's about as exciting as that gets. Okay, so settings. Like I said, settings apply to all of the solutions you open. Presets. This is one that used to really freak me out when I was installing Visual Studio for years. You get to that page, that wizard page in the wizard that says, do you want to be set up as a web developer, a general, whatever? And there'd be like 6 or 7 that you could pick from, and I'd be totally freaked out. Like, if I pick web developer, does that mean I can never build a WPF app? And that is not the case. Basically, it's just trying to say, look, as a web developer, you traditionally want these tools available to you right up front. So that's why they come up with presets, because there's so many different options. I mean, old school C++ developers like everything on the left for some reason. And they have muscle memory for that. And so it's just, it has nothing to do with what works better. It just has to do with what works better for people who've been using Visual Studio for a long time. If you're new to it, it really doesn't matter. Just pick the presets and you'll get used to it after a while.
Yeah, you just do embedded work. Everything, put everything on the left.
Yeah, I don't know why.
I don't know.
It's just a mindset for them, I guess.
Yeah, so a lot of times I put everything on the left. So
one of my favorite things is import, export, and reset, because as a consultant, I tend to move around a lot, and it's nice to be able to get everything back the way I like it. And also, instead of wasting the clients 10 or 15 minutes for me to remember everything I like about Visual Studio. So, real quick, we're going to show that. It's one of the only interesting things we get to do today. So, in Visual Studio, you can go to Tools, Import, Export, Settings. So, now that one seems a little scary. Normally you would think you'd want to save your settings currently, but let's say we made some changes here. I've made some setups, and I always like solution this way, and for some reason I like the Team Explorer sitting right here in the middle. now. It doesn't like it in the middle. Okay. So I don't need to go here first because it's already going to ask me when I come here, do I want to save my settings? You can browse, change where you want it. Now this is saying, what do you want me to reset it to? Because right now I'm in web development. If I wanted to, never even noticed that they had JavaScript. That's cool. It's looking for 15. And don't worry about those. For some reason, about half of them give you that error, and it doesn't seem to affect anything. So now these settings are saved off. When I do something, when I go to the next place, I can take that file and do this. Select import. It'll say, do I want to save my current settings? No. What did I say?
Really old.
Really old.
Oh, yeah, but I'm import select environment. Yeah.
No, and
Oh. Yes, I'm sorry, I was thinking the wrong thing. So really old current settings, well, my old ones.
That's gonna replace it though.
Yeah. No, I'm actually loading it in now.
no.
Did I miss it?
Yeah, that's if you wanted to save the current one, next one
right.
is to select.
No, just import. That's what I thought I was doing.
There it is on the bottom.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was looking at that, it's weird when you're looking at it on a giant screen. Okay, so these typically don't mess with, not a big deal. With these types of tools, the command aliases and the external tools list, somebody technically, a developer who knows what he's doing, could create some nefarious stuff in there and you can import it and do some really bad things, technically. So I always just leave them alone. I never do anything weird with it anyway. So, but this is a way for somebody, so we have big applications that we work with here that tend to take a certain setup, certain plugins, certain whatever, right? And somebody like Raj or Mike or Brandon, could, or a team lead, could set up an export, set up Studio the way a new person coming in can just load those team settings and have everything set up so that at least that part is more comfortable about onboarding with a new company. So that can be very effective for like team leads or to get things set up. Oh yeah, and one of the things I went to say is when you do changes, like when you go from one type of setup of web development to say C# or JavaScript, whatever, mainly what you're going to see change is how the layout looks out here, and also the size of these menus here. A lot of times, things are going to, in the toolbars, with different settings, you'll see more of the stuff over here or more of the stuff over there, depending on what that type of developer typically uses. That's the main changes that you see with the settings. Okay, now the one that I continually, well, not continually, I've really messed myself up a few times doing this kind of stuff. So in the environment, you can do all kinds of So it's always tempting to change things in Visual Studio to make it customized to you. And you can pretty much do anything you want to the text, to everything, white space, line height, line number, everything. And every little piece of Visual Studio, you can change colors, everything. And I'll spend about a half an hour completely making Visual Studio awful to use. Because I'm a developer, I'm not Nick, who actually has an eye and has been trained on design and can make things easier on the eyes and the brain to work with. So typically, I leverage people like Nick and just go with a different theme. I tend to like the blue one. They do have the dark one, which to me is kind of too much contrast for me. But I know a lot of designers love this look. They like dark rooms and black and white for some reason. So for me, that's pretty much way too much. So, I tend to pick the blue, but the light's also good. I've noticed when you've been working, 16 hours in a day, that the light starts to burn after a while. But that's a quick way to, and then you can make small changes from there, which I've done. But just trying to give it a go on my own, I usually create a disaster. And again, moving things around, like you can move, like you saw me earlier, move the individual tab. Again, you can move the whole thing. This puts it up top. It kind of gives you a blue highlight of where you're going to end up moving it to. And a lot of times when I'm running, I'm not remoted in, because a lot of times nowadays I use Azure, so I'm always remoted in to a VM. So I've just got a bigger screen now. But a few years ago, I used to one time I had 3 monitors. And it was really convenient to have like my editor on one screen and all my tools on another screen and my web browser on another screen. Now I just need to get a big enough screen that I can space all that out. Because it does, this can take up a lot of space, and you tend to not use it so much. We're going to go into a lot of tips and tricks in the next few weeks about how to navigate. Navigating, especially when you have more than one tab open, is completely frustrating in Visual Studio. You get lost really fast, really easy, and really annoyed because you're trying to focus on something and you can't find what you're looking for. One of the things that helps me the most, just as a tip for today, this back arrow, which is small and almost unnoticeable, it's like magic. I can't tell you how many times I get yanked off somewhere with a debugger and I just want to get back to where I was. And that back arrow will save you a lot. And a lot of times when you're moving back and forth between files, that'll work too. One of the future ones we'll be working with, I'll show you how to split screens this way so you can look code on the top and the bottom. If anybody likes writing plugins, if you could write a plugin so that normally when you highlight code, like a beginning tag, the ending tag highlights too with a gray. But if you split the screen, so you're looking at the top here and the bottom down here, and you highlight the top one, the bottom one doesn't do that on the split screen, so if somebody likes to write something like that, that'd be awesome. Okay, now here's the, so, I'm not sure why the up and down arrows aren't working, but Visual Studio has Microsoft has changed the way the funsies that we used to have with Express. There is, as of 2015, there is no more Visual Studio Express Web Edition or whatever edition you liked to use. Yeah, it was scaled down, but you know what? I rarely ran into something other than connecting to TFS or something like that that I couldn't do in Express. Now they have Visual Studio Community, which is back to just like Professional. It covers all the different environments. And it's free for a while. You can't get away with it like you did with the Express. So yeah, it's free, and you can't do certain things with it. I don't believe you can hook up to TFS with it. It's a good way to get used to Visual Studio. Typically though, you're going to end up having to move to Visual Studio pretty quickly. Visual Studio is meant for anything under a large-scale team. And when I say large-scale team, I'm talking hundreds of developers. Professional is pretty much all you need unless you're an architect. There's some tools in the enterprise that will help you as an architect. Visual Studio Enterprise is for teams that are enormous and have tons of apps and huge architecture, and I've only worked at 2 places like that, and it wasn't that much fun. And in Visual Studio Code, who's familiar with Visual Studio Code? Pretty cool, huh? So if you were more of a typey person and more of a, if you would like a text editor that also does cool things like debugging, Visual Studio is what you like. Command line tools, lots of typing. They get the UI out of the way that's in the way with Visual Studio if you're not like me and like things being in your way to help you. It's very typing oriented. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's entirely free, does not expire, and it loads up like that. So a lot of times if I want to look, if I'm working on something, I just want to look at an old piece of code that I've written or fire up a file out of a project or something like that, I'll right click on it and say open with Visual Studio Code, and it fires right up. It's really lightweight, does a lot of really cool stuff, and it's very stable, and it's free. So I like it a lot. So you got anything that you've found with it?
Yeah, the only limitation is basically the debugging. I only saw it debugs JavaScript. No JS.
Huh?
Can that build projects? Code?
No.
Can? No.
No.
No,
It can
more like a
debug,
text
debug
editor,
JavaScript. That's
but it
as
does
much
do
as I
some
know.
extra stuff like I said, with debugging JavaScript and stuff like that.
So is that like brackets, what's that other one?
What do you think, like
It's like a Sublime
Sublime on
text.
steroids, maybe?
Yeah, pretty much. Sublime, you can just debug in it a little bit, not that much.
Have you guys seen brackets and Atom? It's kind of like what you were saying. You can debug JavaScript and it's live debugging too. Like whatever changes you made, it's instantaneous too. So I guess that's what it's more compared to. Because Sublime, you can't debug in Sublime, can you?
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it. I wouldn't know, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But cross-platform, that's golden.
Yeah.
Really good.
Okay, so everybody, I'm pretty sure, has probably seen the sign-in option at the top right. Anybody know what that does? I was a little nervous when I would go on a new client. I'd always be a little nervous until I figured it out that, like signing in, does that bring my personal stuff down from Azure and screw up anything at this company? I don't know. I don't want to mess up their Visual Studio. Basically, all it does is set up your custom settings. It synchronizes your settings that you typically use on other machines that you've signed in on, so it knows what they are, and it'll synchronize your Visual Studio with that. That's not a big deal. If you are using online servers like Azure or something like that, you sign into one place and you can get all your Azures work pretty well. If you have registered licenses for MSDN,
Yeah.
It will, and for whatever reason you want to use the Community Edition, your trial will last longer. And allows longer use of Visual Studio Community or free trials. Other than that, I mean, I was always a little weirded out about signing in when I was on a client site, but it's kind of a cool thing, and it doesn't hurt anything. So, and you can always sign out pretty easily. Okay, so basically what we just covered, we have another small section that we're gonna cover, but Visual Studio's integrated development environment, technically what that means is it's not just a text editor. It comes with all the bells and whistles, debuggers, compilers, pretty much everything you need to build an app from start to end. Visual Studio only works with one solution at a time, and you can build more than one project at a time, and typically normally would in a regular development environment.
You're welcome.
So we're going to briefly cover actually what a solution is in a solution. Like I said, it's what Visual Studio uses to open a project. A containing solution is created when you create a project. A solution is not a type of solution. A solution is just a solution. You might have different types of projects, whether it's a WPF or a Windows service or whatever you're developing as projects. But a solution is just a solution. There is no type of solution. And you can actually create an empty one and then add projects to it later, which is I've never done that. But you can. Projects, like I said, you can create as many as you like in a solution. You can create as many references between projects as you need. You do have to be careful with circular references. Does anybody know what that means? Basically, if you have a project that is based off the library that it needs, so it's including that library, and you have another project that includes that project, plus the one in the beginning, you have a circular reference and it'll never build. So, real quick, let's next Lunch and Learn, we actually go into the start page. It's actually like 10 or 15 minutes worth of stuff just on the start page, which is why I said it's kind of hard sometimes to stay on track with Visual Studio because you're always tempted to talk about something you can see on the screen. So the way to create a new solution is to create a new project. There is another way, and I'll show you that in a few minutes, but you always click on the new project or go file new project. One of the things I always thought was interesting is, so when you start typing, you see it also starts to type the solution name. For some reason, I see people leave that way, which is really annoying to me. I'm not sure why they do that. Normally, after I type in the name, then I'm going to go down here and type the solution name for the first time that I'm opening up. I always type, usually it's whatever the primary project name, or a lot of times the primary startup project isn't even named what the solution is when you get to bigger applications. But if it's just a small, simple application, web application, a small one, I usually type the word solution after it. It's not necessary, you don't have to, it's just naming things to try and help your brain kick into what you're trying to do. Also, create the directory for solution. I always leave that. That creates anything else you do, and that puts the project in a directory underneath the solution, keeps everything clean. Add source control, obviously we're not going to do that right now. One of the other things I wanted to point out is, see these odd ones with the blue? Those are for creating NuGet packages. So you can create a class library, or you can create a class library for NuGet. Meaning, is anybody familiar with NuGet? We'll get into what NuGet is, but basically it's a way of downloading code, application snippets, pretty much anything in Visual Studio. Similar, it's Microsoft's version of Node Package Manager, Bower, a bunch of other things that basically you can download code from the internet in a controlled way. This one is through, so you can build a class library that is meant to come down from NuGet. You can put it in the NuGet cloud. So one of the things I was going to show, oh, and I already have it checked. So a lot of times you would see this solution not show up because it's named the same as the project. So you would just see lunch. And I like to see the solution. I don't know why, since you never really go into it, but so if you go to project solutions, you can say always show a solution. I'm not sure why I did that differently. We have a new update. But that way, the solution always shows. Earlier, so that way you can always get to it. Did we already cover projects? We did. If you go, I mentioned earlier, you can. If you go to other types, you can create just a blank solution if you wanted to. But again, I never have. I'm not sure. Maybe you're just setting up a solution so you can tell somebody else to go start filling it up. I'm not sure.
So if you create a new project and you check it in, other people will see a project as well. Do you make it public within the TFS?
In TFS, yes. And normally when you create a project, especially in this type of environment, unless you're just doing something for yourself as like a practice thing, normally you would wire up to, hook it up to TFS, and you would have direction unless you are the one giving direction on where it should go and all of that.
But if you want to do it yourself, and you don't you want to create a project on your own.
And just keep it locally on you. Yeah, when you go to create it, you just leave this unchecked. If you check this and you hit next, the wizard's going to start asking you questions on where do you want to check, hook it up to and all of that. Oh, and the other thing with Visual Studio Code, it only hooks up to Get. Yeah, I just remembered that. It's because I was talking about source control, I was like, oh yeah, it doesn't, for some reason, I think because it runs on multiple operating systems, it didn't make sense to use TFS.
Visual Studio uses it also, so Git. You can use Git in Visual Studio.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't see that.
But Visual Studio only runs on Windows.
Sure.
So we got about 12 minutes before 1. That's pretty much everything. I think I got one more slide. That's just a summary. Yeah. So any questions? We got a few minutes.
I wanted to mention colors-based. There's a Visual Studio's gallery. You can just download a theme if you want. If you don't like dark, light, and regular, you can just download whatever you want.
Cool. And
Yeah, you just import it. Same way you just imported it. You just download the settings files.
Okay, cool.
So I've noticed that when you start Visual Studio, it opens up full screen. Is there any way to get it to open up not full screen? I've looked for the settings for it. I couldn't find anything. Wondering if you made it.
I know it doesn't open if you take it off. Do you normally take it off full screen and then close it? Visual Studio tends to restart in whatever.
It always starts up in full screen, even when I bring it down to the size that I want it, and then I close it. It's fine.
Yeah, you can. I don't know how I've done it, but when I'm working out of my home office, I have a huge monitor, and it doesn't open up to the whole monitor. You can always grab it and wiggle it. You know what that does, right?
Grab it and wiggle it? What?
It clears everything off the screen.
Normally.
Should I have vision?
Of course, it's not working now. It never
What did I
does.
do? I never did that before.
No,
Including desktop, so all open windows will get out of, will.
Yeah, if you wiggle it again, they'll come back.
Good.
Sometimes I get mad and I shake it and I'm like, oops.
So it's like Windows.
You're,
Yeah, that's actually an OS thing.
I think it turns off when you go remote desktop.
yeah.
Oh, is that why?
I think so.
Yeah.
Like grab the remote
'Cause
desktop.
I know what it does to me all the time when I get frustrated. So, I'm sorry, this first one was a little bit boring. It's kind of dry subject, just to get things started, and I'm sure a lot of you already knew most of what we covered. Over the next few weeks, though, we'll be covering more interesting things, a lot more shortcuts, being able to do things like type in cprop tab or CTOR and hit tab, and it creates a constructor for you or a property for you. Being able to hold down the Alt button and drag with your mouse and be able to highlight just exactly what you want and cut that out or copy it. Lots of, as we move through, everybody gets more familiar with where we're at and what we're doing. By the end, hopefully everybody will be on the same level. I'm sure I can tell from a couple of people here that we've got some people that are really high level and some people, like Keith, who don't have a clue what we talked about all day. So. But it's Tim's goal over the next few weeks is to get people interested in this, get people excited about doing what they do every day. I'm lucky enough that I'm a big enough nerd that I used to do this on the side when I was a kid as a hobby, and if I didn't get paid for this, this would be my hobby. So I'm lucky I get to do both at the same time. And learning new stuff and just coming together and showing each other. I'm sure there's stuff in here that you guys know that I don't have a clue about, and it would be really cool if you want to come up and, you know, during one of the lunch and learns and say, hey, this is something I just learned, or this is something I've known about for a long time and it helped me. I can't tell you the number of times I've sat with a junior programmer who's been out of college for 6 months and showed me 3 or 4 things right off the bat that I had no idea you could do in Visual Studio. So, other than that, any other questions or? Cool. I'll go ahead and shut down the meeting. Oh. Maybe.
Last one.
Oh,
Hit that double arrow and open the whole
There
thing up.
it's hard to see from over here.
Don't forget to stop recording.
I'll save it too. Oh, yeah. Where's Tim? Does anybody know how to do this part?
I think you hit the red button.
Yeah, but I don't want it to go away.